Greetings. This is going to be the first demo video in my series on web development with Rails and Git. Um, in this video, we're going to be covering how to set up the development environment, which will be used in all the subsequent videos. I will mention that I believe the following setup steps should generally work for Windows, Mac, and Linux users. Before I jump into the demo, I need to clear up some terminology. So we're going to be using virtual machines in these demonstrations. And basically a virtual machine or VM is basically where one OS runs inside of another OS. And so the parent OS in this scenario is called the host OS. And so imagine you have a Windows computer, that would be your host OS. And you can use VirtualBox to install, for example, a Linux OS as a VM within Windows, and you can run Linux then like as if it were a Windows program. So that's sort of what we'll be doing. The reason for this is so that we can set up a consistent Unix-style Linux-based development environment that goes across platforms. And so the first thing we're going to need to do is install some software. Step one here isn't actually really about installing software. It's just about signing up for GitHub. I'm going to use it a lot in these demos. And so when you sign up, be sure not to lose your GitHub username and password because you'll need them if you want to follow along. I already have a GitHub account set up, and I'm part of a few organizations. And so anyway, I can't really demonstrate that for you, but it's not hard. All right, so we're going to use as a code editor of choice in the demos Visual Studio Code or VS Code. I need to mention that VS Code is different than Visual Studio, the IDE, and so watch out for that. You want to go here to get it. And VS Code is basically just a modern code editor similar to Atom or Sublime Text. Also, I'm going to use some particular set of extensions in VS Code, and so here's the list of them. I can show you what VS Code looks like. It looks like this. And if you want to install the extensions, which I don't recall exactly which ones come with and which ones you have to install, but anyway, you can see right here it shows the ones I have installed. If you want to search for extensions, you just put the name in up here and it gives you search results. I have the Rails one installed already, but if it wasn't installed, there'd be a little green install button which you'd press to install it. All right, and you will also need a bash shell with SSH client to do these demonstrations. To put it another way, you'll need a terminal application that has SSH installed. Windows users, I recommend using Git for Windows. And that comes with a terminal application called Git Bash. And it also already has SSH, so it kind of takes care of everything. So I would suggest doing that, and that's found here. Probably the Git for Windows, yeah, 64-bit. This one is probably the one you want. Mac OS users have a terminal by default, and so I can fire it up, and there's the terminal. It looks like that. Well, yours by default might look different, but that's the basic idea. And it already has SSH, so you don't need to worry about that. And if you're a Linux user, well, you probably have a terminal application, and I'm also guessing you probably have SSH installed, but it is possible your distro might not come with it installed, and then you might have to install the OpenSSH client package. Okay, and next up is VirtualBox, which is software to basically manage and create virtual machines. And so I already have that installed, and it looks like this. I have a few VMs already installed on my machine, so I have a couple Windows ones and a Ubuntu Linux one as well. And yeah, basically this software just helps you create and manage those. We won't actually really use VirtualBox much by itself. Instead, what we're going to do is use Vagrant, which Vagrant in turn uses VirtualBox, and it's just kind of an automation layer to help, again, ease setup and configuration of VirtualBoxes. And so we'll use that. That's a command line application, and so I can't really show you what it looks like because it doesn't really look like anything. It's some commands in the command line. I'll show you later. Okay, so once you get all those things set up or installed, next comes setting up and initializing the workspace and VM. And so the first thing I'm going to do is create a workspace folder, and that's the folder where all the Rails applications are going to go. And so I have a tutorial subfolder, and I'm going to make inside that folder a workspace folder. I'm doing this with the command line. You can do it with your file explorer on your host OS, however you want to do that. But basically, you just need a folder called workspace. And then the next thing we need to do is download a Vagrant file, which is what Vagrant kind of specifies some things that Vagrant will use to set up your virtual machine. And so one thing to watch out for, especially Windows users, is that we don't accidentally add a .txt suffix to this file. It needs to literally be just a Vagrant file spelled like this, capitalized like this, with no suffix. I believe the way you can do this on most platforms, okay, this did not, you just to right-click on it and do save link as, and then it'll give you a place to save it to. And so save it right there in the workspace folder. And of course, I managed to download it a few times as well in the process there. And so if I look in the workspace folder, you'll see that the Vagrant file is now there. And again, no suffix on the end, it's just a Vagrant file. I'll spare you the details of what's in the Vagrant file for now and move along. So the next thing you'll need to do, which I guess if you hadn't already done it, is to launch your terminal, and which again would be Git Bash on Windows, and is the terminal app on Mac, and then Linux users, I'm assuming you can find your terminal application or a terminal application. In the terminal, you're going to need to change directory into the workspace folder. I've already, well, no, I haven't done that yet. I'm going to cd into workspace. And so now I'm in the workspace folder. You may need to, you may find, especially like on Windows, you may want to change the default directory that your terminal opens up in, so you don't have to do quite so much CDing around every time. If you're, by the way, we will use the command line a lot, and I think it's, you know, it's next to like your WIMP type of interfaces, like Windows menus, etc. Type of interfaces. The command line is another major, like one of the big two modalities in interaction, and so it gets used a lot in software development, and so it's worth knowing. So if you're new to it, I would suggest you do spend some time learning about it. And for example, Codecademy has a course on it, and so you could do that. Okay, so I have now CD'd into the workspace folder, and the next step is to run Vagrant up. This is kind of a command that's going to do a lot when we run it this time. And so you be aware this may take a long time to complete. It may download a big file, and it may perform some processor-intensive compilation of Ruby. But once it completes, you'll have a running and provisioned Ubuntu Linux virtual machine. It will be headless, so it has no, basically has no GUI. It's just going to be a terminal type of interface. Okay, so let's do it. Vagrant up. All right, and so, oh, it looks like I need to upgrade Vagrant already. Just did that the other day. I'm just going to kind of peruse the output here. You pretty quickly to the box specification gets updated, and so it looks like the one I have cached on my machine is a little bit out of date. I don't know that that makes a big difference, and probably pretty quickly when you first do this, it'll if you don't already have one cached, it'll download one, and then pretty quickly you'll be running Vagrant up in the future, and you'll see that message, and it's probably fine. And so now it looks to me like it's into the provisioning script. So this is the virtual machine is set up, it's running, and now a process on the virtual machine is installing software packages to basically kind of get the VM, get the Linux installation kind of set up with the right packages, and do some other kind of system configuration to customize it. These red lines of output here, red is supposed to indicate an error. This is not really an error though. This is fine. GPG, whatever reason, sends its output, I believe, to standard error, which makes it appear as red here, but really it's just fine. And so what it's doing right now is installing a program called RVM, which is Ruby Version Manager. We need to do a lot of configuration management in these demos in order to prevent the situation where a year or two down the road, we go to run our software and it's all broken because things updated, like dependencies updated. The Ruby Version Manager is just one of the several programs we use to ensure that the versions of dependencies that we're using get maintained. And now looks like it's compiling and installing Ruby version 2.2.4, which is an older version, but is used in a demo, which will be an example application, which I'll get to in a minute. And then also installing 2.5.1, which is more recent version, and that version they'll be using in subsequent demos. Okay, so so now we are set up. The VM has been configured and provisioned and is now running. For example, we can say Vagrant status at this point, and it should tell us that our VirtualBox VM is running currently. Okay, so next thing we're going to do, now that we have our workspace and VM set up, now we're going to test it out. And so we'll to log into the virtual machine, you say Vagrant SSH. And so now we have SSH'd into our VM. You can see it's Ubuntu Linux version 16.04.5, which is a long-term service distribution. And we're in a home directory, and if you were to do an LL, you can get a file listing of everything that's in a home directory. And things to notice are you have a command prompt here. Vagrant is, I guess, the username, which is just a default thing that Vagrant does. And then this is what it named the host, which is fine. It's, again, kind of just a default. And then this tilde means that we are currently in the home directory. You can see in the home directory there is a workspace folder. It is actually a symlink to a folder called /vagrant, which is, but to us, this /vagrant is a synced folder with the folder in our host OS, the workspace folder on a host OS. So I just made a symlink to call it workspace. And so what we can do is we can change directory using the cd command to make the workspace folder the current working directory. And so I'll cd into that. And I'll do another ll, which gives a file listing. And you can see in there, there's our Vagrant file. That is the very same Vagrant file that exists on our host OS. And then there's a log file, which is, I don't think, very interesting. And there's a .vagrant thing, which is apparently some hidden folder that Vagrant uses for configuration stuff. So, yeah. And again, this is a synced folder, so any changes we make in this folder will be reflected both within the VM and the host OS. In all other respects, their file systems are completely separate as if they existed on separate machines, but this synced folder gets special treatment. And so, for example, again, this is where we'll put our code in here later so that we can edit it using our host OS, like GUI code editor, and then when we edit it, the changes will be instantly reflected so that we can run the Rails commands and other things in the VM, and it'll all work together. Okay, so yeah, we changed directory into the workspace, and the next thing we're going to do is we're going to download a sample app from GitHub, and so I'm going to just run that command, git clone sample app, and you can see it. It does some stuff, and if we do a file listing, you can see that there is now a sample app folder inside the current workspace folder. And so again, this bit here shows you what your current directory is, and so we're inside the home directory, and within the home directory, we're inside the workspace folder. All right. Yeah, okay, that's, you can feel free to read that on your own. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to want to take this sample app, and we're going to want to do some initialization steps with it, and then we're going to run it to see that our Rails development environment is working as expected. So what we're going to do is, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cd into the sample app folder. And so I want to point out that our VM prints a message upon cding into this folder. And that is real important because it means that RVM is working. And RVM does things like automatically sets the version of Ruby to be used, and will keep, for example, a gem set, which is basically just a library of code dependencies that'll be mapped to that project. And so basically it's a form of configuration management. And if you don't get this message or something similar from RVM, then you have a problem. RVM's not working. And usually when RVM's not working, one of the most common reasons is that the terminal application you're using isn't configured as a login shell. This is particularly comes up a lot with Linux users. And so, for example, if I go into the preferences of my terminal application, you can see one of the general options is to default login shell, to select that. And so hopefully your terminal application has a similar sort of option if necessary. And you might have to restart and cd back into the folder to get that RVM message to pop up if you had to change that setting. Okay, but it's working for me, so that's good. So now we're in the sample app folder, and we're going to run a few commands to install basically some library dependencies. The first command is going to install an app called Bundler. So gem is kind of the rudimentary command you use to install Ruby gems, which are basically code libraries. Bundler is, again, something that's built probably on top of gem, which will use a configuration file and provide some additional automation to managing dependencies. Similar to the way that Vagrant uses VirtualBox. So that, we installed bundler, and so now that gives us the bundle command. And so we'll run bundle install, and there is a uh, well, we'll look. So you can see there's something called what's named a gem file, I believe it is, in the project folder, and that contains a list of all the dependencies that the project needs in order to run and acceptable versions for those dependencies. So right now it's as you can see, it's fetching and installing different libraries. This Nokogiri gem has native extensions, so I'm assuming this is always the one that runs a little slow, and it's probably, I'm guessing it's doing some compilation or something that slows it down. But once it finishes, the rest of them roll along pretty quick. Okay, so all right, good. That one's done, and so that we've installed all our dependencies, our like library dependencies now that the project needs. And so the next and final kind of configuration step is to do the rake DB setup. And what this is going to do is so that our web application sample app here is going to use a database backend. And so we need to set up the database. And so that's what this command does. Note that rake, it used to be the case that some of the Rails-related commands you had to run through rake, and at some point, maybe around version 5, they decided that they just were putting it all into Rails. So in the subsequent demo videos, I don't think I'll be using rake much or at all. Instead, it'll just use Rails. But this is an older version of Rails, and so we still have to use rake. Okay, so the database is set up now, and so we can do things like run the automated tests that were created for this sample app. And we can do that by saying rake test. And so what you'll see here is, again, in this software project, there's test code, and so this will run that test code. And that's all pretty Rails, kind of standard in Rails. So it's kind of nice. It's a test harness is another way to think of it. So the tests run, and you can see that there were 67 tests with a whole bunch of assertions, and none of them came back as failed or errors, and nothing got skipped. So that's good. That's what we expect to see at this point. And so, okay, so the tests are running and everything, so things are not broken or very broken if they are broken. And so next thing we'll do is we'll fire up the development web server. This is something that comes with Rails, and it's what you would use for developing your Rails web app code. And so we fire it up, and now it's running. Now notice this one is going to block the console while it runs, and that's fine. I typically, when I'm testing my applications, I will test them in an incognito browser. Because it doesn't save, because you can close the incognito window and it'll delete any sort of session information, which, like, for example, when you log in to a site, log in as a user on a site, you have a session going which keeps you logged in. And so anyway, it can be confusing when you're developing things if that session information hangs around and you're like modifying the code. Things can kind of get weird or broken. So this way we can just, if we want to try it again and have a fresh start, we just close this tab and then reopen it. So let me, following the next step, we're going to open the URL localhost on port 3000. And so you can see this log message started to appear. And actually now a bunch of log messages appear in our server, and you can see the sample app pop up here. To further test out this sample app, we can log in as this user that uses this particular app uses email addresses as login names, and the password was foobar. And it'll even do things like remember you and stuff. I'm just going to log in like that. Oops, I mistyped it. There we go. Okay. Must have mistyped it. And so, so we can log in, and basically what you got here is a Twitter-like app. If you click the home button, you can see the news feed, and so you can do things like add a micro post and post it, and it pops up in the feed and gives you a little notification that it posted successfully. So, so indeed, the sample app is running, and so that's really what we were looking to demonstrate here. That the development environment is set up, we can run our Rails app, and we can do development work on it. The last thing you would want to do is shut everything down when you're, for example, done for the day or whatever. And so the first step there is to kill the Rails server, and you do that with the Control-C command, which is, I guess, I don't know if it's really even a command, but basically that means hold down the Control key on your keyboard and press the C key. And so now you can see we have now exited the server, and we're back to our command prompt. And so we're still in the VM, and so we want to log out of the VM, and to do that, we type the exit command. And so now our connection, we are now disconnected from the VM, and you can see that the prompt now changed where it was Vagrant at Ubuntu Xenial. Now it's SDF at Munich, which is my computer's name, and we're back in that tutorial workspace folder on the host OS. And then the last step, if you want to shut down the VM, because the VM is still kind of like running as if it were a computer running within your other computer. And so if you want to shut it down, you just say vagrant halt. And it's going to shut it down for us. And that's that. If you wanted to do some more work later, when you come back to it, you would do vagrant up to restart the VM. And note that you do have to be in the workspace folder when you run your vagrant commands, because that is where the vagrant file is. And so vagrant uses whatever vagrant file is in the current directory. And so if you were in a different directory with no vagrant file, I believe it'll just kind of error out because it doesn't know what to do. So it needs that vagrant file to tell it what to do. And so anyway, you can run vagrant up to fire up the virtual machine, and then you can run vagrant SSH to log into that virtual machine and continue working. And so anyway, that concludes this demo video. I hope it was helpful.